While planning a hike on Google Earth, I spotted something strange high in the Rocky Mountains. A perfect stone circle sitting quietly on a grassy slope. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the more I looked, the stranger it became. Not too far away were stone walls. The most shocking part, they stretched for miles across the Continental Divide. At first, I thought they were modern, but these walls stood here long before the first Westerners arrived. We know this because one of them, John Rollins, crossed this pass in 1873 and recorded what he found that day in his diary. Quote, "At the summit of this pass are the remains of an ancient settlement or battleground. Stone walls 2 or 3 miles in length, rock pits 4 feet deep by 8 feet across the top." Was Rollins right? If so, who built these walls? When were they here? And why choose such a remote, dangerous location? I didn't have the answers, only questions. So I left the Front Range, driving deep into the mountains, through winding canyons until the road ended. There are no roads up to where I'm going, so I packed my gear and set off on foot, up into the clouds in search of answers. The plan for today is to hike about 6 miles ahead, where I'll intersect a lake that is at the base of the Continental Divide. I'm going to catch the Perseids meteor shower tonight, and then tomorrow morning at the crack of dawn, I'll get up and hike on up to the ruins and see what there is to see and hopefully start to make sense of it all. So really any second now I should be getting my first good view of the Continental Divide. You know, like I said, it was a climb, and then now I'm on a flat spot, and then tomorrow morning it's going to be another big climb up to the divide. Kind of like 2 stair steps. Oh yeah, I'm starting to see pretty stuff. Really, the divide is over here, obscured by the trees. It goes this direction. And this is just part of it, a peninsula shooting off of it. The reason I wanted to pause here and talk about this view is because when you hear that quote at the start of the video from John Rollins in 1873 talking about an ancient settlement, he was right up there on that ridgeline. So tomorrow morning, that's where we're going to go. We're going to go up and see if we can see what he saw, 150 years ago. Originally, that is the route that the Ute and Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes would walk when they went over the divide. And later in history, about 150 years ago, when the first fur trappers came through, they actually had pretty good terms with the tribes and learned the routes that they walked and followed them. And so later on, when the first Western settlers came, they were up here to mine. They wanted to build a wagon road to get up and over the divide. And so they followed the exact same route that the fur trappers followed, that the recent Native Americans followed, and that the ancient Paleo-Indians would have followed up and over the divide, which is this exact ridgeline here. I chose to camp a little farther back from the lake. Too many nights my bag has been raided by hungry mice. I've noticed a pattern. Whenever it rains or when I camp beside a roaring river, the mice grow bolder. Normally the sound of teeth on fabric is sharp enough to wake me, but the trickle of a brook or the soft percussion of rain muffles it completely. I'm convinced the mice understand this. 4 patches already scar the bottom of my pack from those rainy night assaults. That's why I picked this quiet spot, still and silent enough to give me a fighting chance. The forecast for tonight promised clear skies, but I set up my tent anyway to shelter my camera gear. However, I laid my quilt and my sleeping pad out on the ground directly beneath the stars. Tonight, the Perseids, the brightest meteor shower of the year, were set to blaze, and I wanted nothing between me and the falling stars. My goal this morning was to hike up to the Continental Divide, where the stone ruins lay. Before heading out for this trip, I used Google Earth to scout the surrounding ridgelines for miles in every direction. I chose this area for my visit because it had the highest concentration of well-preserved features. I marked out the 4 most promising sites to explore and hope for the best. I only had 1 day up here, so I wanted to make every minute count. So I'm slowly connecting some dots as I'm hiking along this road. This is the historic route that 1890s railway took up and over the Continental Divide. You can see the really beautiful grade that it takes. It's super easy, something a train could easily make up. But I know where the railway ran because I did some research in an archive in Boulder where I found these 2 old maps. One was from 1880s, and it's an old wagon road map. And the other one was built in 1920, and it showed the railway. When I first looked at those maps, it was confusing because there are no mountains drawn on them. There are no rivers drawn on them. Most of the cities on them don't exist anymore. So as you're looking at it, it just kind of looks like lines on a page, and it's difficult to make sense of. Yeah, I see roads, but where are they exactly on this planet? And then I later realized they were drawn on a PLSS grid, the Township Range and Section grid. And I overlaid that grid on my modern topographic map, and I basically drew in on my grid where the lines ran on that old grid. And then I just removed the grid, and I now have what looks like any other hiking trail drawn on a modern topographic map. Consulting that map, I know that this is where that 1890s railway ran. Look at that. As I make my way to the first site, you can probably already tell I'm high up. But what you might not realize is that these aren't just any mountains. They're the highest peaks in the continental United States. This ridgeline is known as the Continental Divide. It stretches across the U.S. from Mexico to Canada along the Rocky Mountains. It's called the Divide because it's so high that it splits the continent's rivers. A raindrop falling on the east side flows toward the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico, while one falling to the west runs to the Colorado River, through the Grand Canyon, and out to the Pacific Ocean. I'm headed to 12,000 feet, though the tallest peaks here rise over 14,000. Most people rarely encounter objects on that scale, so it's hard to truly grasp how massive they are. So how tall is 14,000 feet? When most people picture tall, they think of skyscrapers, like the New York City skyline. The tallest there, One World Trade Center, rises about 1,400 feet above the ground. From its top, you look out across all of Manhattan. Now imagine stacking 10 of those towers on top of each other and living up there. That's the scale of these mountains, and it's here, at this staggering elevation, that the Paleo-Indians built their hunting ground. So what I'm looking at right here is a stacked stone cairn, and if you look that way, you see another one. And so these are pretty common when you get above tree line. Often when you're above tree line, only have rocks you're walking on, so you often don't have a trail that's as visible. I mean, the second the snow drops, it covers the trail up, it disappears. And so these are really only useful kind of in the shoulder seasons in fall and spring when snow starts to drop. The reason I'm talking about these cairns is because somewhere over here at site number 1, there are supposed to be stacked stone cairns put in place by the Native Americans thousands of years ago. So roughly that's kind of what I'm looking for, something like that. I'm not really sure what their purpose was or how visible they'll be, but that is roughly what I'm looking for just ahead. So this is the first site that I picked out to come and investigate on foot. I'm officially finally here. I started on the other side of that ridge line and then back behind at least 2 more ridge lines yesterday. I'm not exactly sure what it is that I'm looking for. What I had heard about and read about was the possible presence of stacked stone cairns. So these things can be very subtle, but I am noticing now how these rocks clearly were lined 1, 2, 3, 4. Could be another example of what I'm looking for. Rocks stacked. Clearly rocks did not arrive in that place naturally. They were put there by people. The question is when, and even if this is what it was that I was reading about. If so, it's very subtle. On this side, I'm actually able to look out and see the Valley of Middle Park. We know going back in history, 1840s to 1870s, when the first Westerners arrived here, that the Ute tribe lived back in Middle Park. It's this little depression valley that's more sheltered in the winter, and there were people who lived there year round. This is the route that they would walk, and this is the route that the game have followed for all of history. And definitely one of those routes would be right up this grassy ridge along this cliff line. coming up to the Continental Divide where they would have a choice. Do I go off this way or that way? And I would be willing to bet that most would go off this way because it leads to that low point pass where they could kind of skirt on through. One thing I'm sure about is that it's going to get more interesting as I keep hiking ahead. There are these little rocks that are poking up almost like arrowheads. I'll try to crop in more to make it more clear, but they're up there on the ridgeline. They look like little heads poking up. So this is a good example of what I'm referring to. When you view this triangular rock off from a distance, it really sticks out against the skyline behind it. And if you look up here, you can see more of these rocks. So right beside that stacked rock, there is a little hunting blind here. You can see I'm hidden behind the rocks, but I could pop up over this boulder, and then I have an amazing view of the hill that I just climbed up. Looking up, they look like little heads poking up, and I can't help but wonder if these serve a purpose of camouflage. If you do have people who are up here poking their heads out of these hunting blinds, maybe the deer get accustomed to seeing them, and the deer would confuse your head poking out for one of these triangular rocks. Because as you look all along here, you see there are those rocks poking up. So running right along here, you can see what is my first sight of a wall running along this hillside. I'm thinking maybe we'll find something of interest over there if we go that direction. The wall runs right along here, and you can see there's a blind here. There's also an amazing hunting blind right here. Let me come show you. I feel like it shows it best when I pull it up and over. I started out earlier way over there, walking up the hill that way. That's where I saw the little, what looked like heads poking up on that ridgeline. So I followed my curiosity up there, and then I encountered hunting blinds all along that rock slope. And I noticed right here, this wall figure coming down. And then right here, you can see there's another hunting blind right in front of me. And then the wall continues all the way off to the cliff. So from standing right here, you really can see what's going on. Right here, there's a gap in the wall. If I'm the deer walking through, here's the gap in the wall, and I have two hunting blinds here. I have a third one here. I have the camera positioned looking out from a fourth hunting blind, and right up behind it, there are two or three more hunting blinds. So this would be, in this whole slope, probably the most active kill zone. The satellite view helps you locate these things, but it doesn't give you really any of the story. You really do see so much more once you're down here on foot. It's funny, when I was looking at that area before, like I said, I almost didn't even include it on my list because I couldn't really see much. I just more read about stuff. Once I got down there, it was absolutely fascinating how much could be pieced together. Anyway, that's the end of Site 1. Site 2 should be a quicker stop, and I'm headed that way now. A few weeks back, I was hiking along what were once the earliest wagon roads in the Rockies, dating back to the 1800s. I noticed something striking. Any structures made from stone in the last century were all still there, while any structures made of wood vanished long ago. Let's take this stone figure, for example. Can you guess what it once was? To me, it looked like part of a castle or a bridge, but neither of those made any sense in this location. Are you ready for the actual answer? It was once the stone foundation of an enormous wooden ore mill. I never would have guessed its real significance without that historical photo. My key lesson that day was realizing how easy it is to assume that the present condition captures the full story. What exists before us now is only a fragment of what came before. As I looked at the cairns before me, I suspected there was once a lot more to these stacked stones than what remains here today. So I've hiked up the hill from site number 1. Site number 1, you can see the tree line down there where I kind of started out when I first found those fledgling cairns. So this is the start of site number 2. This is that singular rock wall running straight ahead. And what caught my eye up here was that I only saw one wall. I was confused as to what its purpose was exactly. So this is probably the best view of site number 2. You see it's really pretty small, but that's the wall right here. And then right here, I didn't see this on the satellite view, right at the end of the wall, there's a hunting blind right here. I didn't see a wall over on this side. I thought it was maybe an incomplete structure, but I realized instead of having a wall over there, there's just maybe a 6 or 7 foot drop off on the hillside.
that the animals would not want to go down. They would just naturally kind of follow this route right here. I've got to hike down the hill to get over to site number 3, so we'll head there next.
The layout of the walls at the first and second sites reminded me of walking the catwalk at a cattle stockyard in Oklahoma. There, cows were corralled into tight pens, and metal fence lanes or chutes controlled their movement around the yard. It's easy to imagine how the walls at these 2 sites once directed the flow of animals just like cattle through a stockyard. When I returned home, I dug deeper into my theory that these cairns held more significance than what remains today. I came across a similar game drive site in Canada where bison were guided toward a cliff jump. One independent investigator reported the following finds. There were, quote, hundreds of stone cairns that comprised these drive lanes, built several meters apart, and were augmented with dirt, buffalo dung, tree boughs, and sagebrush prior to the hunt. Band members equipped with buffalo hides would hide behind these cairns and wait. I couldn't help but wonder, could the cairns on this ridge have served a similar purpose?
This is my first view of site number 3. The wall is crossing the Continental Divide Trail right here. And something really interesting about site number 3 is that it's much larger than the last 2 sites. This one covers probably 1/3 of a mile in length all the way down to the kill site, which should be maybe another couple hundred yards ahead. But then way over here, coming from originally what is like site number 1, there is another rock wall that follows the cliff face. I'm going to call that wall number 2. I'm going to call these 2 together here wall number 1. And where they meet, there's from what I saw in the satellite view, a gap. So I'm going to go down there and investigate exactly what's going on at the corner of these 2 walls. So I'm over here right at the corner where the 2 walls meet of site number 3. And you can see, looking straight out ahead, how clear the wall is. This is wall number 2 that I was referring to earlier. It runs all the way along the cliff face here for probably 1/4 of a mile down that next hill. And if you can visualize it, way further out there is where site number 1 was. And then I'm going to turn to my right over here. Straight ahead is wall number 1 of site number 3 coming into this corner. You can see it off there in the distance. This area right here is littered with hunting blinds. All of those rocks are 3 and 4 foot deep hunting blinds. But it runs along the back here and it joins right about here with this clear lane of passage. You can see how wall number 2 over here continues on up the hill. Sites number 1 and sites number 2 are almost feeder sites. Any animal that made it through coming to here, if it was wounded but continued on, man, it would be in a world of trouble right here. I feel like the hunting blinds are easier to see when you're not in them, so I'm going to stand behind this one. Your point of view is kind of terminated at that line, but if you were to look over here to the right, up at this hill, that is the area where I saw the pointy rocks, what I might call the cairns, and all of the hunting blinds. You could get a heads up from your fellow tribe members up on that hill through hand signals that animals are coming up the ridge to this corner. If the animal's injured and it's coming through, it's going to get slowed down here. And this is really, I think, the major carnage zone. This is where the animals would for sure be finished off if they made it through either site number 1 or site number 2. And I start to see how sites 1, 2, and 3 seem all interrelated. It's like actually it's all one large site. I guess that's the first number of sites, but I got one more to visit, which is on the next ridge line over. So I still have a little bit of hiking to go. But this final site is, I think, maybe even the most impressive of them all, just because of how far it runs. I'm calling it site number 4, the mega complex. So we'll head on over there and hopefully get it walked down before the day ends and before I get rained on up here. If you're ever curious what the view looks like, this is it from the top of the Continental Divide.
On my way to site number 4, I briefly hiked along the Continental Divide Trail. The CDT is a national scenic trail that traces the divide for 3,000 miles across the United States. Along it, I met a thru-hiker who was already 5 months into walking this trail in its entirety. To better understand these hunting grounds, I wanted to hear his perspective, what it's really like to live up here on the divide day after day. Fortunately, he agreed to an interview.
ready for any type of condition because the temperature spans usually can run 50 degrees. So this morning I got up and it was 33 degrees. It jumped up to 84 in the sun at a lower elevation. And at elevation, if you get 30 to 50 mile an hour winds, you're just fully exposed. Wisdom and maybe a little bit of fear. I said, maybe I'm just going to run into town just to get off the ridgeline. It's easier to deal with bad weather in town than it is to be sitting on at 13,000 feet with a heavy storm front running it.
One can only wonder what it was like for people thousands of years ago living up here on these ridgelines where there's no road to town and there is no town. You know, it would be a much longer trek back down, right?
It is a unique skill set to be able to live in such a challenging environment and to be able to navigate from mountain snow to hard desert and to be able to find enough sustenance to survive in it. It's just an incredible feat, and I have to respect that.
I call Site 4 the Mega Complex, the largest and best preserved concentration of features I've seen anywhere along the divide. Where Sites 1 through 3 are compact, Site 4 runs for over a mile along the mountainside. If the earlier stops were clues, the Mega Complex is the case file. I was excited to trace it out on foot and see what it reveals.
I look up this slope, I see what look like little, almost rock terraces. This is the stone wall that I was referring to. The line runs all the way down to where those circular figures were. And you can't see it from here, but there's a similar wall lower down on the hill that converges almost like a V shape right up to their wagon road. It sure seems like it's almost like a way to shepherd animals through. You'd be in a concealed position to pop up, or even to observe and communicate with other people if they're in a better position. It really reminds me of the hunting blinds that exist up in Montana, and it's interesting, it aligns right with the wall coming into it. If you look up there, you can see more stacked rock figures up on the hill, so maybe I'll go up to those next. So I'm seated in one of these hunting blinds up on the hill now, just behind the camera up here, this giant cliff, which serves like a wall. The animals don't want to go off the cliff. And so you have a lot of hunting blinds positioned up here, and what I'm noticing is when I came up the hill, I barely saw them. I knew what I was looking for, but I could barely see them when I came up the hill. But once I got up on the high ground up here in this hunting blind, and I looked out, I realized, looking over these rocks, I had direct line of sight on all the other hunting blinds. And also the reason I'm in this hunting blind is that the wind never stops up here. I'm up at high elevation, I'm above the tree line, so there are no trees to block the wind. And so if you're up here hunting, that's actually a tremendous advantage. So the wind pretty much always, due to the Coriolis effect, goes from the west to the east. So there's no opportunity for the animal walking to the east to catch wind of my scent on a normal day when the wind is blowing off this direction. And as the animals approach, the animals aren't going to see them, they're not going to smell them, and they're not going to hear them. So you can see why you would actually be willing to hike up here all the way from the Front Range 50 miles away in the summer to hunt, because you have control over all of the variables that make it so impossible to hunt.
A question that still lingered in my mind was how old these ruins are and how we can be certain. As I read further into the subject, I discovered that the answer has been written on the surface of the rocks this entire time.
So I've picked this pile of rocks basically at random, but what you can see on these rocks is the same little plant growing that we saw all the way over on that other ridgeline, the green lichen. I'll zoom in so you can see it better. Lichen is not just a single organism, it's a combination of cyanobacteria and a special type of fungus, which when they're both present, enable the lichen to develop. What's really interesting about lichen is, one, that it's very hardy. It can grow up here where even the trees don't grow. It grows for tens of thousands of years. and it also grows at a consistent rate that is measurable over time. And so a long time ago, over 100 years ago, archaeologists figured out that you can use lichen up here in these high alpine environments to measure the age of rocks. Now, you're not measuring the age of the rock itself. This is a granite Precambrian 2 billion year old rock. But what you can measure is how long the rock has been seated in its current location, which is a different thing. And in fact, it's a lot more useful when trying to date these structures. So how do we do that? We're going to hop over to just any rocks randomly in this field. We'll take this one. So the bottom side does not grow lichen. If you kind of conceive of this as like a square has 6 sides. You got these sides, these sides, these sides, and then the top and the bottom. All sides of the rock will grow lichen that are exposed to air, which is basically every side except for the 6th side on the bottom. When this road was constructed, they overturned these rocks, and they took them from here and they put them somewhere. Where did they put them? I bet in this giant pile running along the road. So let's go look at these rocks now. You can see by looking at these already disturbed rocks that this bottom side once was the side touching the ground, and then on all the other sides you have the lichen growing. Not that interesting because this was done within the last 100 years and there really hasn't been enough time for more lichen to grow on this rock. But now I want you to imagine that that rock got moved 5,000 years ago. If that rock got moved 5,000 years ago, what you would see is something similar at that time 5,000 years ago. Lichen on all sides, except for the side that was once touching the soil. But now, if you fast forward to today, 5,000 years in the future after it got used to create a hunting blind down here. So it could have been sitting in that field for 30,000 years before the Paleo-Indian picked it up. The other 5 sides show growth. The side, when they picked it up that was touching the dirt, some of those sides that were facing down became up-facing sides. And so what you'll see is a new growth pattern of lichen that is much younger than all the other sides. You can take a look at all of the rocks in the hunting blind, the diameter or the size of the lichen on each of the 6 faces, and see if you can find a face that has a younger lichen profile. You might begin to see the pattern that 75% of the rocks that have a young face and 5 old faces in terms of the lichen profiles all correspond to new growth that's, let's say, 4,000 years old. So the archaeologists would look at specimens like what I just showed you there and measure them for decades. They built lichen growth profiles, charts that show you specifically on this green lichen that grows out here, what its growth rate looks like. And so once you know that, you can then use the growth rate to back calculate the age of the rocks. And that's what lichenometry is. And so they came out here and they did that. And what they found was these hunting blinds using lichenometry age between 500 and 4,000 years old. And so if you look at this hunting blind, you might think that this boulder here is a feature of the hunting blind. But if you look at it, you'll notice that there really is no green lichen growing on it. And so to me, that indicates that this actually rolled down the hill and fell on top of this hunting blind a long time ago, but not thousands of years ago. Basically, it rolled down here after this hunting blind was created. And I would be willing to bet that if we just look uphill, we see all sorts of boulders up there that were pushed off of this road when they made it. So I think whenever this road got made, maybe 100 years ago, that a boulder rolled off and it rolled right on top of that hunting blind, and it now looks like one of those other blinds where the boulder is a feature of the hunting blind. Anyway, that begins to answer the questions of how old these structures are.
And so when people think of Native Americans, they tend to associate them with devices like the bow and arrow, and also with animals like the horse. If you had access to horses and you had the bow and arrow, these hunting blinds and rock walls would seem a little overkill. Like, why go through all of this effort if you could just ride an animal that's almost as fast as a deer and can shoot it with a bow and arrow that has like a killing range of like 50 yards? The reason that's a misunderstanding is because the bow and arrow actually only dates back about 1,000 years in Native American culture, and the horse effectively dates back 500 years. The horse originated in North America, but it actually ended up going extinct like 10,000 years ago. So for the last 10,000 years, there has been no access to horses, and the bow and arrow was not invented in North America until 1,000 years ago. So if you could go back to the time period when these people were hunting, they were hunting on foot and with spears.
And I think that's something a lot of people wouldn't understand if, all of your understanding of Native American history came from what you were taught in high school and what you saw in Hollywood. And so now you have to go back to that time period and think, okay, I'm trying to hunt on foot with a spear. I know from having done a lot of hiking that it's incredibly hard to surprise prey animals. They have an unbelievable ability to smell. They have an unbelievable ability to hear. Their eyesight is often not as good, but between their sense of smell, which we can't even begin to comprehend how powerful their sense of smell is, we also can't begin to comprehend how effective their hearing is. My point here is, the next time you go for a hike, if you come across deer, I want you to pay attention and notice, did the deer see you before you saw the deer? The answer is almost always yes. And in the rare cases that it's not a yes, that the deer saw you first, it's usually because you came over a hill and, the hill muffled the sound of your steps. And often the wind direction is blowing away from the deer to where it disguises your scent. Okay, maybe you saw the deer from 100 yards away. Here's the key question. Could you get on foot, walking up to the deer that hasn't spotted you yet, and get within 25 yards of it without it smelling you, hearing you, or seeing you? And the reason I ask that question is because that's exactly what the Paleo Indians had to do over 1,000 years ago when they had no horses, no bow and arrow. All they had were spears that they would throw with devices called an atlatl. An atlatl is basically a similar lever that attaches onto the back of a spear, and it enables you to throw it a lot faster and farther and with more force. And so even using an atlatl, the effective killing distance of a spear thrown by a Paleo Indian would be about 25 yards. That's the outer radius of the kill range. So that's why I asked the question, how would you get within 25 yards of a deer or an elk? Not just getting lucky, but doing it consistently over and over in a way that would be necessary to feed your family or your tribe to not die out here. You realize you've got to find a way to answer that challenge. Basically, develop an ability to get within killing range, 25 yards using a spear, of these wild game. And so when you come up here and you look at site number 4, it's the best demonstration of how they were able to accomplish that. And so I'm really glad I was able to come up here over these few days and that I was able to share that with everybody else out there who doesn't have an opportunity to come up here and see this. Because I think that's the second part of the puzzle that's missing, is that not only does this exist, but nobody knows about it. So anyway, I hope people enjoyed watching this video, and I hope to make more like it in the future. So that's all I got. I should probably sprint down this mountain because it's literally raining in every direction around me right now. Though I will say the sunset is astounding. So maybe we'll close with some sights of the divide. But anyway, hope wherever you are, you're doing well, and hope to see you again.